Committee on Utilities to come to order. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Chairman Kidd.
Present.
Vice Chair Bromley. Present. Representative Engel. Here. Atchison. Here. Black. Brown. Here. Fitzwater. Lewis. Here. McCreary. Here. Simmons.
We have 7 present. We have a quorum, and Representative Brown, I know it's early.
Waiting for green and white.
Yeah. This morning, we're going to go into executive session, so we're going to hear House Bill 1734 in executive session. I move that House Bill 1734 be due pass, and we do have a House Committee substitute, and I'm going to offer that House Committee substitute ends in point 02C. Yep. Does everybody have 02C? Okay. I'm going to move for its adoption. Any discussion? I'll say I had to sneeze for a second. Go ahead. Well, I tried not to sneeze. Sorry, I had to sneeze.
Thank you, Mr.
Proceed,
Chair. Would you mind going over the changes from the original bill, please?
Yeah, let me go ahead and start into all of this, what we did here on this amendment, on this whole sub. We took a simple 14-page bill and made it 60 pages. If that didn't freak everybody out, we got that and went, what in the world happened here? We deleted the first 6 pages. We added a few bits of language in there for water and gas. But we added 3 lines in the last 50-some pages. We had to open another chapter. That chapter was like 50 pages to get those 3 lines in there. Those 3 lines are the ones that allow the Public Service Commission to hire external counsel and experts. Some of this is getting so complicated with securities and other things that we want to give them the option, if they don't have that in-house expertise, to go ahead and hire that expertise. So that's what we've done basically with this whole deal here. Any other questions, Representative?
Yes. I mean, can we go through page numbers of the big changes? I know that there were some changes to some rate caps.
Oh, that's the other thing. I'm sorry. Yes, we also did that. We changed the expiration of all of this. We extended that another 5 years, or 10 years, I believe, 10 years.
And can you go over the reasoning for that? Because we went to 2038, is that right?
Yeah, 33. 38 and 33. It expires on page 14. You'll find it expires in 38. And that was for the discounts. And then we changed the whole bill. What page is that? You remember when we went from 28 to 32? On page 8, I believe. Yes, on page 8. Part of this was we wanted to make sure we had adequate time to look at the data to make sure that plant and service accounting was really working. And so instead of deleting it all, we extended some of those dates to make sure we had data. That was the main reason for that, to make sure that it was really doing what we wanted it to do.
And that data was for the PSC, not for the utility companies, is that right?
Yes, that's that is for the PSC to look
Okay.
at, yes.
And can you explain, like, why 10 years, though? What the reasoning behind that was?
No more than, what do we really need to look at? It was either 5 years or We just decided on 10 years. I can't say there was a real logical reason to that other than we wanted to look at the data over some time to make sure that it was right, to make sure that we were doing what was right, to give those guys the time to do that. It's kind of an arbitrary number. But that would give 15 years total for the whole bill for us to look at, for the beginning, the inception, and the passing of the bill. So we were just I was concerned that we had enough data to look at this and make sure that this was right. And 5 years was not enough, I didn't think.
Okay.
Any other questions? Representative McCreary.
So, we had a pretty healthy discussion during the original hearing about the compromise that was passed in the Senate a few years ago to get this bill passed in the Senate. The compromise language, my understanding from being on the consumer side of this, is the original date was picked so that we had 5 years of data. Then we would collect the data and see if it led to improvements that could justify the rate increases. And so now we're going from a few years, 5 years to 10 years, which allows for the rates to continue to increase for our constituents, but yet we will have no real way to know if it's justified for 10 years. And my concern is because of term limits that there will be no one left in this building that understands this original bill or the bill from a few years ago. So
Probably right.
It just makes me really, really anxious.
The intent
about
was
that.
was to do the opposite of that, which was to collect that data to make sure we were doing the right thing. I hope we've achieved that.
Well, the whole deal about being a monopoly is you don't have competition. But part of the agreement is you're supposed to take care of your stuff. You're supposed to make sure things are reliable, modernized, updated, and safe, and all these things. So, I still am hesitant to allow for these rate increases for the utility to be doing something that they should be doing already. So I'm just sharing my concerns.
No,
So,
I actually agree with you. I do have an amendment to add to this.
okay.
And the amendment ends in 01H.
Would you explain to us in
The
Lakewood-
amendment is on the first page of the
Yep.
of the committee sub now. The amendment removes the words "without any offset." I was concerned that we have to have the ability for the PSC to look at all the differences that happen over the property taxes and to be able to then, if they need to offset other expenses or incomes, that they have the ability to do that. This language where it said they could not do any of that. And so I took those words out to make sure the PSC had the complete power to look at all these charges and expenses and everything else. And then if they needed to offset something else, they could. Doesn't mean they have to. Just means they could without any offset. Just means they were stuck with what they had.
Well, and I appreciate the amendment. I don't know if maybe I just live in the wrong part of the world, but property taxes seem to always increase. And so, having this property tax scheme in here could be problematic. If property taxes would be able to be deferred, they put in, they become an asset, and then eventually, without this amendment, then profit could be collected on it. So
Correct.
I think what you're trying to do is actually, it seems to be a good thing, but that being said, I don't know that because I haven't had a chance to really analyze it. We got the 60 pages on Monday afternoon and then the amendment yesterday. So I'm going to be honest, your amendment looks good, but I'm not exactly sure yet.
Yeah, the intent is to give the PSC the ability to do what they need with those numbers.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? Any other discussion? Okay. Seeing none, I do recommend that Amendment 01H be voted do pass. All adopted. All in favor say aye. All opposed, say no. The amendment has been adopted. I now move that we roll the amendment into the House Committee sub and adopt the House Committee substitute. All those in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. I now move that House Committee substitute for 1734 as amended be voted do pass. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Chairman Kidd.
Yes.
Vice Chair Bromley. Yes. Representative Engel.
Yes.
Atchison. Yes. Black. Yes. Brown. Fitzwater. Lewis. Aye. Berry. No. Simmons. Yes.
By your vote of 9-1, we have adopted House Committee substitute for House Bill 1734 as amended. That will conclude our executive session, and we'll go into normal session now. At this point in time, Representative Bromley, you have the chair, sir.
We will now open the hearing on House Bill 1673, sponsored by Representative Kidd, and you may begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. For the record, I am Representative Bill Kidd, District 20, and I'm presenting House Bill 1673 to you today. It's not 60 pages. And I guarantee you we were all surprised at that one when that came through. I'm not going to jinx it by saying it's simple, but it relatively is. And I will start off by saying if you go to page 3 in the bill, line 86, you will find that what I'm doing is I'm striking out that sentence that says, the commission shall not disallow any portion of such cost recovery on the basis that. And so I will tell you right now that after long talks with several people, we're still not quite happy with this language and striking that one sentence. Here was the intent. The intent of all this was that when this original bill was passed, was that we would not suffer a Texas style of event where we had a Colmageddon, and we got down to where we had no excess capacity to generate load so that we wouldn't have people without electricity during critical times. To do that, the idea was to come up with, why don't we have standby coal plants on standby, which is not an easy situation to do. It's not easy to keep a coal plant ready to go and fire up, and it's not easy to fire one up if you let it go into mothballs. It's going to take weeks to get it to go, if not. So it's a difficult situation, as I'm sure Representative Bromley can tell you from having managed the plant. Once you shut them down, it's hard to get them going again. So we wanted to have those capacities there to be able to have the ability to keep kind of a hot standby in a plant. And maybe some of the technology of the way that's done is maybe it's operated at 1 or 2% peak load kind of capacity from time to time. So we wanted to have that to be sitting there, so those things would be available. The problem is that the expenses associated with doing that do not match a normal generating plant. Because you may have some expenses in the hot standby plant that you would not have in a regular operating plant, and vice versa. And so the issue was that with this language, it said that because we couldn't quite get there, the commission shall not disallow any expense that goes into the hot standby. Well, I had a problem with that when the original bill, when this was done, and I still have a problem with it. I think the commission should have the ability to look at the hot standby plant and look at the expenses that go into that. The problem is, how do we tell the commission we want them with all due diligence to understand that there is a difference between operating plants, standby plants, and the expenses don't line up or may not be the same. In other words, we don't want them to look at a standby plant and say, hey, you've got X number of thousands of dollars in this category and it doesn't match up to a normal generating plant, so we're going to disallow some of that. That's not the intent of this, because there are going to be differences between the two. What I didn't want is, I didn't want the utility running everything into the hot standby and calling it an expense. No offense, utilities, but somebody's got to watch the hen house. Okay, so I didn't want that. Secondly, my concern was, quite honestly, not that I'd ever lie to you, but honestly, is that when we did securitization, that as you take time to do your plants and you start to shut them down and you start to look at securitizing them and selling them off, that in that meantime you classify them as a hot standby and you use them there to collect money as a hot standby until you get your securitization done. So I didn't want that either. There's specific purpose for having these things happen the way they do. We can say this when we're sitting here talking and everybody understands that concept, but to put that into words gets to be difficult without unintended consequences. So I've let most of the utilities know, and I'm letting the committee know that we're going to work on this language to how we do that. How do we take those concepts and say, we don't want a Texas-style event, we want hot standby, but we also don't want you to use it for securitization purposes. In other words, to make money while you're waiting to sell it. And we don't want the PSC to come in and say, no, you can't disallow all those things. With this sentence, the PSC had no perusal over any of that, and so they couldn't disallow any expenses. So my object in bringing this today was to work on the language, to start the conversation of how we put those things together so that we come out with an equitable solution of how we have hot standby, and maybe we look at this eventually and we go, maybe we don't need this whole paragraph, or maybe we do. Don't know. We were going into uncharted territory here when we start shutting these reserve capacity plants down. So there's a whole lot of things to look at, and I'm telling you right now, I'm open to working on this language, to coming up with ideas, to putting those things into concept. So whenever these guys that are behind me come up here and say they hate me and they hate this, that everybody just needs to realize, no, it's just starting the conversation. How do we fix it in a manner that's equitable? So with that, I'll take any questions.
Do any members of the committee have questions for this bill sponsor? Representative McCrary?
Mr. Chair, to inquire.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. So one of the questions I have, and it might be for a witness, so is this idea of a plant being shut down, but yet, there's still folks there, it's still being maintained, that kind of thing, versus something being mothballed. Those are, in my opinion, two really different things. So can you talk through what your intent is and maybe how you see this being used in different ways? Because I'm in the St. Louis media market, so I've been following what's happening in Illinois. A lot of coal-powered plants are being shut down in the state of Illinois, which definitely impacts us. So there's a difference between being shut down versus just being
There's a difference between shut down, which
Right.
means I'm going to shut it down, we're going to tear it apart, and it's going to go away, versus sitting there and now it's still operating as far as its ability to operate is still there. I'm certainly not the technical expert on that. I'm sure there's people behind me that can answer those things, but there's a huge difference between shutdown.
Right.
It's just, we're done, we're not going to maintain it, and it's over, versus it's ready to go, but how do we turn the switch on and make it produce? So there's a whole technology of that. How you keep do you keep the boiler fired up? How often do you have to fire up the boiler? You know, how long does it take you to fire up the boiler and to get going and start generating? What's that mean? Do you have to keep a full complement of people on? What are the SPP and MISO standards for that? How do we fit into that whole integrated network of? And I'm sure there's a lot of people behind me that can talk to that, but. And that's why I'm saying I'm open to look at this whole thing again about standby, shutdown versus standby capacity. As an electrical engineer, one of the things you learn is that you cannot run the grid on renewables. Okay, it just doesn't work that way. And part of that is because you have to have that inertial mass of spinning of a turbine. To handle a load, when a load comes down the line, you have to have that turbine spinning. There's an inertial mass in there to handle the load. That type of situation cannot be transferred to a renewable. Solar, battery, wind do not handle those things. And so you have to have baseload capacity sitting there. There has to also be a heartbeat on the grid. You have to have 60 cycles per second, you have to have voltages, you have to have all these things that you can only really do with today's technology in some kind of spinning turbine. And so as we shut these plants down and we move more to renewables, when we have a situation where now what happened in Texas was, you know, they thought they could go out and buy power, and that's been kind of the general idea, is that if we get short on power here in Missouri, we can go to Illinois and buy power, we can go to Kansas and buy power, we can buy power off the Southwest Power Pool. And so the issue then was that nobody had any excess power to sell. And so we were using everything we could, they were using everything they could. Actually, the other side of the state had some excess capacity, but we had some other interconnection problems. That's a whole different story. And so how do we then keep these plants in a standby mode? Because it cost billions of dollars for the people in Texas when everything shut down. So it's one of those, I got to go to the dentist, which tooth do they drill on deals, because it's painful no matter what you do. It's painful to keep these and to pay for them if they're not being used, but it's also painful if you have to have them and you don't have them.
Well, and I agree philosophically, and there's examples all the time of using taxpayer money or constituents' money to be prepared for a what-if scenario.
Yeah,
So
this is all open.
Yeah, so I would prefer to pay a modest amount along the way to keep a plant operational rather than, you know, going in there and, you know, having to, like, you know, parts are rusted. I mean, that's the scenario where it could take weeks. and
Yeah,
then it defeats
that's not the
purpose.
scenario we're going for.
Okay.
That is not it, because that is a disaster then, and you're too late.
Right.
If you can't fire your plant up in a short period of time, it's too late.
Yeah.
The disaster is past.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there other questions from the committee? Representative Simmons, go ahead.
To inquire, thank you, Chairman. And it's may again be answered by someone but behind you. With this, you know, low capacity factor operation at that level, is there a way to quantify what that would be and then do a may allow for the PSC to include up to that cost level in their assessment? And that way it's kind of a fixed known?
Gentlemen, I don't know. That's a question for people behind me. And the reason why is because we get into interconnection issues, we get into all sorts of other deals that happen, that requirements that I'm just not. I don't do that for a living, and so those guys behind me, you might ask them that question.
Thank you, Chairman.
Are there other questions from the committee? Okay, at this time, we'll open this up to conversations from the audience and those willing to testify. I just want to remind everybody that before you testify, make sure you fill out your witness form. And at this time, there's quite a few people to testify on this, and try to keep everything, just to the point and brief. At this time, if there's somebody,
Could I maybe make a suggestion?
yes.
I don't know if anyone's here for informational purposes to give us committee people a little more perspective, and then we may be more prepared how to answer. I don't know if anyone's here for that, or it's just the pros and cons. It was just something so that we all knew some background, but if that's not available, then that's fine. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I think we'll just go ahead and go, we'll just alternate between somebody in favor and somebody opposed, and then we'll follow up with it. So if somebody wants to testify on, that's in favor of this bill? So we're not going to have to alternate too much, it looks like. So we'll go ahead and we'll take testimony from people that are opposed to this bill. So just go ahead and state your name and affiliation, and make sure you have a witness form filled out.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. My name's Randy Eminger. I'm with the Energy Policy Network, and we understand it. I visited with the chairman yesterday, and hopefully there'll be some suggested language changes that we can work with. The Energy Policy Network's a nonprofit organization. We represent coal-fueled electricity. We're not funded by the utilities, but we are funded by the coal industry. I would like to just touch base a little bit. Having lived, Mr. Chairman talked about Texas, having lived there for over 20 years, I left 3 years ago, thank goodness, and got out just before the disaster hit. But you had an official death toll of 247 died of hypothermia, $80 billion in economic damages to the state. And the governor and the studies that came out showed that not only the natural gas, but being over 35% dependent upon intermittent generation, wind primarily, solar some too, had a lot to do with the problems they ran into. Missouri's in good shape. You're 90% base load, nuclear, natural gas, and coal. So you're in good shape, but you're part of two regional power pools, one being the Southwest Power Pool on the western side, and the other being MISO on the east part of the state. These two power pools that you're interconnected with include 22 states, and in those areas, they're rapidly heading toward the same situation we have in Texas. Basically, we've seen in the last 5 years 60 baseload power plants closed down, one nuclear, 29 coal plants, and the rest of them natural gas that have closed in these two power pools. A total of 22,000 megawatts of generation, enough to generate electricity for 14 million homes, average use for 14 million homes. That's in the last 5 years, replaced with intermittent power. In the next 8 years, by 2030, announced baseload power plants in the Southwest Power Pool and MISO, another 68 baseload power plants have already announced they're going to close. 36,000 megawatts of generation, enough to power 19 million residential homes. Again, we see a dangerous trend. This is where Texas went. Even the governor of California came out and said maybe we have rushed to renewables a little too fast in our state. And to have the governor of California say that is something. I put a packet out for everybody. I won't go through that. There is one chart, pie chart in there that I would just speak to real quickly, and it just shows that by 2030 in MISO, if things go as they are now, with the announced closures of baseload plants, 45% of the generation in MISO will be intermittent power, wind or solar. In SPP, it's even worse. 56% of the generation in the Southwest Power Pool states will be intermittent power. Now, we have backup batteries they're working on. They're looking at other storage units. Of course, transmission will help. But we need to be cognizant and aware of how quickly other states, not necessarily Missouri, but your neighboring states, especially Minnesota that's tied in with you, Wisconsin, Illinois next door, how quickly they're closing the baseload plants in those states and replacing them. And the reason why is obvious. Last year, 2021, $14 billion worth of federal subsidies to wind and solar plants. Baseload cannot compete when the opposition, we'd love to compete straight up, but with the federal subsidies, we have a hard time being able to compete. The utilities do, I think. So we just felt like the language that was in the bill did provide for an opportunity to keep these plants on. We found that to some extent, and I did visit with 4 out of the 5 Missouri Public Service Commissioners last week. They're really focused on cost, and I understand that. That's their duty, but they're not looking at the overall reliability picture and what we need as far as keeping the baseload plants on. So basically just wanted to state some of the research we've come up with, why we have concerns with the chairman's language, and welcome working with him on anything that we can do to keep some sort of incentive to keep the baseload coal plants in place. Thank you.
Are there any questions for this witness? Representative Lewis.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for providing, such, so much information and well organized. This doesn't take into account the transportation sector of the energy sector, really. This is transmission of electricity. But, we just yesterday up on the floor, we were talking about putting in electric charging stations for transportation in the state of Missouri right now. That means about 71% of that would be coming from coal generation. If some have suggested maybe by 2030, 2040, that we're getting 50, 60, 70% of our automobiles driving around electric. That's right now 35% of the total energy used in the United States. I'm sure that's similar to what it is in the state of Missouri. Where will that energy be transferred to?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but the nation's increasingly electrified. It started with computers, laptops, cell phones, now automobiles. And I'm sure batteries will get better and better, but you're right. We're wondering as well. The demand's growing after COVID. The economy's now booming, or was. The inflation might have. But to some extent, I think we're in a situation where we're going to have to look at going back to, and I think they're looking at nuclear, small modular nuclear plants, but we're going to have to start building some more base load, I think, to handle the future.
Yeah, that's, I think we kind of forget, we think, well, we have the amount of electricity we need currently. But if we start shutting down coal plants and then we start transferring all of our transportation to electric vehicles, which I understand that we're going to be driving more electric vehicles in the future. There's no doubt in my mind. But if we start doing that without planning ahead for how we're going to generate the electricity, and this is exactly what you're talking about. And I know sometimes in the, we want the cheapest that we can get, and we all want things to be clean, but we also have to have power, sustainable. And I appreciate what you've done here. Yeah, this is a complicated topic, and one will just have to continue to study. But we have to look at the numbers we have here. We're going to be using more electricity in 30 years, guaranteed. Because if we're driving all of our vehicles, that's another 1/3 of the energy economy is going to be drawing electricity instead of using petroleum if we're trying to cut out our petroleum. So appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Are there other questions for this witness? Representative McCrory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So building off of what Representative Lewis was talking about, some of the data that I'm seeing shows that we're actually that as things become more energy efficient, that we're actually using less electricity on things that used to be big consumers. So can you, and I know if this is not your area of expertise, I understand, but I respect your experience and would love to hear your opinion. So although more and more electric vehicles are going to be coming on board, considering all the manufacturers have committed to that, things that we're using in our homes are more and more efficient.
I agree, and technology is going to continue to advance, and I think we're going to continue to have things come out that are going to hopefully use less electricity as we move forward. I don't know that it's going to offset the demand and the economic growth that we're going to have, but it is beneficial, and a lot of the utilities will tell you how much they're putting into energy efficiency programs.
Well, and there are incentives available for families, for example, to upgrade their water heaters to things that are more efficient, and that's every time those things happen, whether folks do it voluntarily or because something broke and they're replacing it with something new, we are seeing efficiencies there. So the issue I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, and I think it goes a little bit outside of the scope of the bill, but yet is connected, which is this idea that, like, we're Missouri legislators, and we have the Missouri PSC that regulates things that happen here, but yet we're so very dependent on what happens in other states and what other administrations are doing. So, again, I'm in the Illinois media market because of where I live in St. Louis. I'm seeing some things happening in Illinois that are a little unsettling because I realize so many of our constituents, including some of the municipal utilities in our state, are connected to the decisions happening in Illinois. So can you talk through like what is or is not happening, and is there a way that as a legislature we can make sure that we have somebody or a group of folks that are keeping an eye out on everything so that we're not so focused on Missouri that we're missing out what's happening and not factoring in plant closures and things like that?
Sure. And actually, both the Southwest Power Pool and MISO have produced and are still involved in changes because of that storm last February. Both of them jumped on it with a major study that goes forward and looks at what do we need to do. A lot of it deals with additional transmission lines, but at the same time, closing the plants and building more transmission, trying to get those sited, trying to get them permitted, trying to get the landowners and the eminent domain, and it's like siting a pipeline. It's very difficult and takes a lot of time, but both Southwest Power Pool and MISO are working on that. Each state has representatives on both of those, and you have two of your public service commissioners, one serving on a MISO panel, one on SPP. So my recommendation is to visit with your public service commissioners that serve on what's called the State Regional Committee. And that State Regional Committee controls a lot of the policy that goes forward in both the Southwest Power Pool and MISO. So part of my spiel last week to the commissioners was you need to be more active in those regional transmission organizations. You have a vote for Missouri, and you need to make sure that you're looking at heading it the right way.
Well, I appreciate those comments. I guess I would I feel more confident reaching out to the PSC, encouraging them to communicate with the legislature if there are things we need to be doing to help, protect Missourians. So I appreciate your input on that. Thank you.
Representative Black, I believe you had a question too.
I do.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To inquire. Thank you for being here. Probably not surprised to the committee that I agree we need more baseload power, considering other events in the session. I have a couple of questions for you related to your materials.
Yes, sir.
And I would ask you to, I'm looking at this packet.
Okay.
With pie charts in front, and then looking at the page that says in the middle, baseload power is critical to SPP during extreme weather.
Right.
We found that one. Of course, we're aware of that, painfully aware of that, and the circumstances in Texas illustrate it better than any of us could hypothesize. the tragedy there, both in death and dollar value damages, is, in my view, at least partially due to over-optimistic planning by the RTO down there. And so, but specifically, below the chart demonstrating how much baseload power did pick up during that bad weather, you have in your paragraph enumerated 1 below SPP warning signs. The SPP has closed 15 baseload power plants early. Can you tell us what you mean by early?
Sure. When you go in and permit a plant, most of the time, well, all of them that I know of, you permit, you go before the Public Service Commission and say, this coal fuel power plant is scheduled to run 60 years. Basically, 60 is about a coal plant. Natural gas is more like 40 years is what they look at for natural gas. Nuclear is even longer than those. So by early, it means that they might be 30 years old, 40 years old. It might be a coal plant that's 40, 42 years old. And by early, we feel like the natural life of that coal plant is 60 years.
Okay, so it had 15 years of active and available production without having to be replaced under current estimates, and yet it was shut down. That asset was lost.
Right.
And is there an impact on consumers when that happens?
Well, yes. I mean, there's decommissioning cost associated with it, and the utilities look at that versus the price of renewables, replacing it with wind or solar, and I think that there is expenses associated with keeping a coal plant going. There's constant environmental regulations out of EPA. So, when you look at a coal plant going its whole natural life, it's not just the upfront capital cost. It's the additional costs that come from, depending on who's in the administration and what EPA you have, how much you're going to have to do that coal plant. But
and trying to guess what those regs might be from one administration to the next is, I guess, a bit of a project.
It is. Yes, sir.
The next question is at the top of the page, and thank you for reminding us that our electrical demand is going to increase. Yes, there might be some offset by efficiencies, but I don't think anybody expects that will actually offset the demand in a thriving economy like we have in the United States, thankfully. But I like you to see if I'm understanding this correctly. At the bottom of page 3 of the page we were just on, it says, in the future looks much scarier. Based on your next sentence, I agree with that word. Of the new electric generation plant by the utilities in the SPP by 30, 91% is scheduled to be wind and solar.
Yes, sir.
91% intermittent power for the estimated new load by 30?
Yes, sir.
Capacity?
That's what's in the queue. Southwest Power Pool and MISO both look at the utilities and what they have planned to build in the next 8 years or between now and 2030. And in the next 8 years in Southwest Power Pool, 91% is wind and solar.
I would agree that's scary. So thank you for your testimony, sir.
Thank you for your testimony, and at this time, be happy to have another witness come forward that's not in favor of this bill.
Mr. Chairman, Jason Clint, Senior Director of Government Affairs for Evergy. I'm not opposed to this bill. I'm here for informational testimony only because I've been here long enough to know how to find a way not to testify opposed to the chairman's bill. But I truly am a little bit, I guess the reason I would say I am informational is because I agree with where the chairman is trying to go. It's not that I think that he's trying to undo something. I am concerned with how the bill is written, and so I do think that there needs to be some changes to it. But let me just, first let me just say this. This is innovative. What Missouri is doing, this part-time, I call it part-time coal plants. I don't know why, but that's what we call it in both Kansas and Missouri. That's an innovative solution that we don't see anywhere else. And so commend you guys for having that in the bill. And if it needs to be tweaked, I don't know that I agree with that, but if it needs to be tweaked, I think that's the right idea rather than to take it out. Because I do, for all the reasons that we've just talked about, which is the changeover in generation mixes from intermittent to baseload, there's no substitute for having 60 days worth of coal on the ground for times when the wind isn't blowing. And it's not, you know, we all rightfully point to Uri. We all say, this is a Uri problem and we need to avoid that. I will tell you, last week in Kansas City, when we were in the single digits, we didn't have any wind. And it's not, we love wind, but there are just some times that wind isn't blowing and it's not available. And until there is an actual baseload substitute, and it could be hydrogen, it could be small modular nuclear, it could be something, it could be battery storage, it could be something that we don't even know about today. But until that is here, then our coal plants continue to almost operate like battery backup for those renewables. For when they're not available, we continue that. And you know, Evergy is 50% of our delivered energy is carbon free, which means it's nuclear or renewable. So we have made great strides in the sustainability portion, but there are two other words that are very important to us as well: reliability and affordability. And so we got to try and balance that stool. And this part-time coal plants language is a part of that stool. Now, we haven't used it today. We do have, you know, I don't know exactly when this would come into being, but I do think it's important that we have this. But I just want to go through just two very quick things so that we're all in agreement on kind of where we are and maybe what good would look like. But if you look at the first sentence, and I have it as on page 3, line 81, you all may have different things than I have, so I'll read slowly, and maybe you can catch up with me. But it's essentially, it says that the commission will decide whether or not it's just, reasonable, and necessary for reliability reasons, which means that we as the utility have to go forward to the commission and we have to say, we think that this plant is needed for reliability. Here is our plan for running it and how we would do it. And the commission has to say yes. They could also say no. They can also put conditions on what we do. They could say, well, you can do this, but not that. And so we feel like there's a pretty big level of interaction with, and as you all know, in commission proceedings, it's not just us in the commission, it is every other intervener that is, you know, whether it's the OPC or the Sierra Club or the industrials. I mean, more acronyms than I care to spew out. So but they're all there at the table. They all take a look at it and they say yes or no, or these are the conditions. Where we have a little bit of, where I think we're having a little bit of trouble here is the way that the chairman's bill is written, there would be a second bite at the apple. And so essentially they would come back then and say, well, yeah, but that's not reasonable. The problem for utilities, and Representative McCreary is right, we're a monopoly, which means we're not a business that is able to take maybe some of the risks that non-monopolies would, is we can't make a multi-million-dollar decision without knowing what is recoverable and what's not. So we need that certainty that once the commission says, yes, this is what you can do, these are the conditions on it, that once that is done, we can actually get that recovery. Otherwise, it sets up kind of a second, kind of a guess, choose your own adventure type of thing, where we may choose to do it, but not have any idea whether we're going to get recovery or not. And that would put us at a pretty large financial risk to take that type of chance. That's just not, for better or for worse, the utility regulated industry, that's not the way it's set up. We kind of have we're big rule followers. We know what the rules are and we follow the rules as it goes through and are able to make decisions when we have some certainty. And so I think even just including words like prudently incurred or something like that, maybe towards the end, which would still give the commission the ability to go back in and say, well, that wasn't prudent. They can then come back in and challenge. I'm fine with that level of risk, knowing we're going to have to make prudent decisions. I think that's always true. That's why I'm not sure it's even really needed, because I think the commission always has the ability to go in and challenge prudency. But something like that, I think, might be how we get there. But I just want to close by saying that I think overall this is really good legislation. When you think about from a cost perspective, if you have a part-time coal plant, you're not raising rates. In fact, it has a decrease in costs. You have less fuel costs. You have less O&M costs. You're able to take those and reduce those and pass those savings on to customers, while at the same time kind of maintaining some reliability and having that a backup there that should you need it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I continue to be informational only in my testimony.
So I have one question for you myself. When utilities file their integrated resource plans, those plans have their future capacity and what they plan on doing in the future. So, in my opinion, I guess you put in that you're going to close those plants early or whatever. So how do those integrated resource plans play into this? And then how does your cost analysis, when you look at your stranded assets and everything in those plants, if you shut them down early, how does all that tie together and why you're not using these as part-time plants now?
Well, we aren't using them as part-time plants now because they're still needed for baseload capacity. So we are not to a situation, as I said, where we would have a plant right now that is part-time. However,
when I said you, I meant just in general the industry.
Oh, good. The royal you. I think I think we should, and I think that's what people are looking at. And I think people are looking at how do you balance those three. I think those three words: sustainability, affordability, and reliability. I think that's not just us. I think that's the industry, and so I think that's what people are trying to figure out. This is a part of the transition that is going on, like it or not. I go through the reasons why we are going the way we are, but as we transition from kind of coal and natural gas and some of those, as we move more towards some of these others, we're going to have some way to kind of bridge that gap until there is, something out there that makes sense as a baseload capacity now. In terms of what was your second question? I'm sorry, I threw myself off.
Well, these plants, you take into account the lack of depreciation and things of that nature in your stranded assets on those plants when you do decide to shut them down.
You do, but that's why you all passed securitization last year. So if we decided to do that, we would use the securitization bill to do that. This was included. This language was included in the securitization bill, but it really isn't securitization. It's just kind of it was a reliability piece to go along with the securitization. But your question was about IRPs, and the answer is we always are looking forward and projecting. Right now, we are not projecting a situation with any of our coal plants where we would necessarily use this, but as the gentleman just said, we're part of the SPP market. If the SPP came in today and said you have to shut down all your coal plants, we'd have a hard time keeping the lights on. And so this is meant as a hedge for this, but as we look forward, this could extend the life of some coal plants. It could be that we take a look at, and I don't want to use names because it will freak out people at coal plants, but we could take a look at Plant B, we may say, we'd like to retire that in 2030, but we're concerned about reliability, so it's going to go part-time for a while we kind of figure out the reliability of it. So that's the intent of this language, and I just hope that we keep it usable. I'm concerned that if we put some words in here that make it two bites at the apple, I'm worried that it just becomes language that's not usable.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions for this witness? Representative Black?
To inquire, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. You raised some interesting PSC 101 issues here that I'd like to. In our system, and I guess all over the country, we have a monopoly, a regulated monopoly, to provide this essential service to the people of the state. It's something that every state uses, and the PSC, I understand it correctly, and you can tell me if I'm right or if you'd like to explain a little better, has this job to try to be fair to the consumers and yet allow the energy producers to live in a climate where they can meet the needs of the consumers. Is that basically correct?
Their job, really, if you look at it, is to balance all the interests, and it's more than just the utilities and the customers. It's the industrial. I mean, I guess they're customers, but if you look at industrials, they have a different specific need. The consumers and residential have a different need. So what their job is it's quasi judicial, and their job is to gather the evidence and then to balance and find the best. You know, it's never, the reason you have to make a decision is because it's not obvious, right? It's not easy. And so their job is to take the hard part and figure out what the best balance is for everyone involved. Not, yes, us, but also the customers, for everyone. So yes, their job is to balance.
And we hear about concerns, legitimate concerns, that the customers might be paying too much. We hear that. But then we also hear, probably not as frequently, the concern that you mentioned, that to be able to engage in a multi-million, perhaps billion, perhaps more than $1 billion dollar investment, you need some certainty that, in fact, you are going to be able to recover those costs, or the industry does, to recover those costs when, in fact, that incredible amount of investment is committed. And so my question is, if you don't have that certainty, when we're talking about the kind of money we're talking about today, if you don't have the certainty and you don't think you're going to be able to pay your investors a dividend or recover your costs from the consumers, what happens?
Yeah, all those, let me take that broadly. All those things are concerns of ours. So let me just tackle that last part last, which is what happens if you can't go to your investors and show them, talk to them about the return they're going to get? Well, the cost of borrowing money is going to go up, and that's going to make rates go up. So yes, we have to have some certainty, because our investors, and by the way, I say investors and everyone thinks that I'm talking about Wall Street fat cats. A lot of investors in utilities are pension funds. They're people, because we pay a dividend. And so when I'm talking about investors, that's who I'm really talking about. But there are a lot of utilities that you could invest in. And if you see a utility in a state that has a bad regulatory framework, that maybe their ROI is lower, maybe there's not certainty, you wouldn't invest there. And all that's going to do is drive the cost of capital up. It's going to make it more expensive for us to borrow money and able to invest in the things that we need to invest in.
Might there also be a risk that those costs are so high that you just don't build that plant?
Yes, I mean you may have to find an alternative if you can't raise the capital, which I think is what you're saying. But if you can't raise the capital, you may have to find an alternative plan for what you can do,
which may not be as satisfactory as what you would like to do to serve your customers.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the chairman's bill and other bills that we see here, his major concept here is to put this difficult decision on this important issue. How do we keep enough capacity around in the hands of the PSC with regard to guidelines that everybody can live with, if that's the way I understand the bill, and I think that's the way you understand it as well. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Are there other questions from the committee for this witness? Seeing none, is there anybody else here to testify against this bill?
Good morning. I am not testifying against. I'm testifying for information purposes only.
Okay.
And that is not because I'm opposed to this, because I'm in favor of what you're doing here, Mr. Chairman. The problem is I worry about what's happened with other bills, that the subsidy is going to come back next time and it's going to be ugly, as what happened with the previous bill and as what happened with several bills that have come through here. Let me just say, I just want to say one thing about about utility rate making 101. I've practiced in this area of law for over 30 years. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. John Kaufman, and I'm testifying today on behalf of the Consumers Council of Missouri. My interest is residential consumers, your constituents, what they have to pay when they put their bills on the kitchen table every month, and see if they're going to make it. the basic regulatory compact of the Public Service Commission is very similar, and I appreciate a lot of what Mr. Clint just said, and I agree with it, except in one point. It is not about certainty, it is about uncertainty. It's very important. We're dealing with a monopoly here, and that does not have the constraints of the competitive marketplace to drive its decisions about doing the most cost-efficient thing to, protect your constituents. The Public Service Commission is set up, because this is such a complicated area, these commissions are set up to balance all these things. And very often, the right decision involves, some compromise between varying interests. The securitization law that was passed by this body is not the most pro-consumer securitization law. There's some that are pro-consumer and some are not, and I say this is a very utility-favorable, consumer-unfavorable law. The chairman's, and of course, this, as was stated, this is really not within the securitization part of the bill, but about the part-time coal plants. And I think the concept is good. I think what might happen, absent this language, the Public Service Commission will go, okay, well, we're going to pay you a certain amount in between what you would if this was running all the time and what would happen otherwise. And by the way, the most important language I think to preserve in here is that the commission has full discretion to do what it can, and the words just, reasonable, and necessary are very important. And I would not be in favor of replacing that with the word prudent. Prudent is extremely strict, and it's been rendered almost meaningless as a protection for consumers in Missouri law. I think just and reasonable is what you want. And I probably see more than my case of regulatory disasters. I get called in, to litigate situations after what's hit the fan. And in fact, I'm in litigation in Texas on behalf of the citizens of Austin involving, the disaster that happened with Uri. And what seems to be common to all the disasters that wind up being a big litigated nightmare is that something got passed in the legislature that tied the hands of the commission or the regulatory body. And so why I might seem alarmist about some of this is only because so many times unintended restrictions are placed into the law that prevent the regulatory body from reacting when you have a situation like a storm Uri or some other problem that is, caused billions of dollars to be foisted upon the consumers. And the problem is when you have certainty, when you guarantee the utilities the profits that they have, well then you're basically shifting that. It's not like risk goes away. You're transferring that to your constituents. You're forcing the public to take a risk, and the utility is allowed to make a decision that it doesn't bear the consequences of. The laws that were set up, well over 100 years ago, to make sure that we had a monopoly that did sharpen its pencil and pay attention to cost, is that it wasn't always certain whether it was going to get. It was going to have to prove that it could produce what it needed to produce, and then the Public Service Commission would review it after the fact. And that, knowing that, restrained some of the more, imprudent or unreasonable actions on behalf of the utility. Part of this regulatory compact, to remind you, is that the utility has no competition. Many of their business risks are already mitigated by legislation and regulation, but at least they have to maintain safe and adequate service, and they also are permitted the opportunity to earn a profit that many Fortune 500 companies would be envious of. For all of the electric regulated utilities here, their allowed return on common equity is between 9 and 10%. And so if they are given a certainty that they will be able to recover whatever they spend and earn almost a double-digit profit on that, that doesn't quite mix up. If you're going to be giving the utilities guaranteed profits, well, then those profits should be less. That number should be lower to represent the risk. The risk should represent the return. So as long as we are allowing these utilities double-digit profits, then we should expect them to face the Public Service Commission in lieu of competition. Now, there are states that have, unraveled things like Illinois and Texas and so forth, and they add a lot of complication to things. It's a different way of doing it. But as long as you have a monopoly, we need to make sure that there is oversight. So in almost all of these bills that cause concern from the consumer perspective, I think the most important thing I would urge you to do is make sure that built into the laws that you would like to add or revisions to the law include the ability of the Public Service Commission to come in if there's a disaster, if there's a terrible problem, and fix it. Allow the Public Service Commission to fix the problem. So, Mr. Chairman, I think you have hit on what I think is one of the most important things, is that we preserve Public Service Commission authority. And these guys are not hard on the utilities. We have a very pro-utility, favorable Public Service Commission. They very rarely dock them for anything, but you certainly want them to have the power to do so when something bad happens. That's all I have.
Are there questions for this witness from the committee? Representative McCrary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is something that I continually have to remind myself about. In other parts of our life, the words just, reasonable, necessary, prudent, all would show up in a thesaurus as synonyms, but these words really do matter when we're looking at things that can happen to consumers in front of the regulatory body. So can you just, give us a utility 101 on how we got there and why prudent is the least protective for our constituents? And it's not just residential. I mean, that it's not protective for businesses, for anybody that uses utilities.
They are, and I think they started out to be very similar terms, but legally, prudence has become something that is presumed. The utility is presumed to be prudent. Someone has to find, quite a bit of evidence to overcome that word. I would say it's one of several things that could be the grounds of making some adjustment to utility rates, but just and reasonable is the umbrella term. Just and reasonable is the basic mission of the Public Service Commission. So as long as you have just and reasonable there, you are preserving the Public Service Commission's discretion. Now, with securitization, you make a bargain. Maybe it's a Faustian bargain, but you supposedly get a lower return in return for giving more of a guarantee to the utility. So the argument is that, yes, we're going to tie the hands of the commission. They won't be able to ever reduce these charges for consumers, but in return, supposedly there will be less than that 9 or 10% profit. So that's the balance. You're balancing the return with the risk. And hopefully that, if you're giving a very generous return to the utility, you want to make sure that they're the ones bearing the risk, that they're not, taking risks, and the public is the one, facing the dangerous risk.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for this witness? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else here to testify on this bill? Please state your name and affiliation.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Trey Davis, registered lobbyist, president of the Missouri Energy Development Association. Appreciate the history lesson. It would probably be good if you want to go into 101s to actually and talk about Public Service Commission definitions and duties. It'd probably be good to have the commission actually be able to speak to those, which I think may be good at some point to do. Pertaining to the actual bill at hand, I'm here for informational purposes and just wanted to reiterate, as Mr. Clint said, our desire to continue to work with the chairman and the committee and trying to find a way to address this specific issue without making changes to Public Service Commission oversight, et cetera. And one more thing, if you do want to have a one-on-one, I would love to come in and give the perspective of the utilities as well, because it's good to have, for everybody to have a balanced view of both sides of the apple, including the regulators as well. With that, I'll take any questions.
Are there any questions for this witness? Representative McCrory.
Thank you. Just a comment, if we're making suggestions on who we'd like to hear from, I want to remind my colleagues that we would also need to hear from the Office of Public Counsel, because contrary to what some folks think, I don't necessarily think the Public Service Commission is always looking out for the consumer, and that's why I think we would always want to make sure we get an opinion from the Office of Public Counsel. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you for your testimony. Are there other witnesses here to provide testimony on this bill? At this time, I'd like to ask if the Public Service Commission representative, Mr. Anderson, would come forward, just in case the committee has questions for him.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Doug Anderson. I am the Legislative Director for the Public Service Commission. I've heard a lot of our name being thrown around here, so if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
So now's your chance, committee members, if you have any questions for this witness. Okay, seeing no questions for this witness, that will conclude the hearing on House Bill 1673. And at this time, I'm going to turn the chair back over to Representative Kidd.
We're adjourned.